Start the webinar.
Good luck.
Yeah. Hi everyone, good afternoon and welcome to this CDI seminar. My name's Emmy, I'm from ITAD, one of the partners in CDI. I hope you're all safe and well wherever you are watching us from. I'll be running the logistics of this webinar from my home in Brighton in the UK. And I just want to run you through some of the things that we'd like you to be aware of while the webinar is ongoing, and then I'll hand you over to Heel and Mel. So in terms of housekeeping, every attendee here is muted at the moment and you won't have the option to unmute yourselves. So if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function that you'll see in the top ribbon above you. It's a little speech bubble with the question marks in. It should be in the middle or to the right of your screen. So please do click on there and ask us your questions. Heel will be keeping an eye on the questions as they come in. And you'll be able to see the ones that we publish. There is a slight delay on this webinar, so everything that we say will be 10 to 20 seconds before you actually hear it. If you're having any technical problems, please do let us know again in the Q&A. But the delay is really there just to make sure that the bandwidth is moderated and everything is working as it should be. But as I say, if you have any technical issues, please do let us know in the Q&A. I will now hand you over to Heel, and you won't hear from me again. You might hear my voice, but you won't see me again. And yeah, I'll hand you over to Heel now and enjoy the webinar. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Giel Ton. I'm the Director of the Center for Development Impact. Welcome to this CDI seminar. The Center for Development Impact is a joint initiative of the Institute of Development Studies in Brighton, ITAD, a monitoring and evaluation provider, headquartered in Brighton, and the University of East Anglia in Norwich. We started in 2014 with a series of reflection on methods in the evaluation of impact of development programs. And especially we focused on methods and processes of evaluating that could handle the complexity of programs with multiple activities and where development organizations work in collaboration with others. We especially focus on methods that foster learning, not in the least by the people that are creating the dynamics of change, people that live in cities, villages, slums, who are the actors of change in their communities, and also people that work as practitioners or policymakers that want to facilitate these change processes. On our website, you will find a range of publications and recordings of seminars, with the latest publication written by Mel Punton and her team in ITAD on the use of realist evaluation and the topic of this seminar. As Emmeline explained, I will monitor the Q&A section. Your questions will only be visible for us, the organizers. After each section of around 10 minutes, I will distill a limited number of questions of clarification, and I will leave others for the main discussion after the presentation. During the presentation, however, you are able to vote on the questions that are being raised, and this will influence my selection in the Q&A session after the presentation. I hope it works, and I give the word to Mel.
Hi everyone, and thanks very much for joining today. So like Heel said, my name's Mel Punton. I'm a senior consultant at ITAD. And I've been working on realist evaluations for quite a few years now. Like some of you listening, I was supposed to be at the Realist 2020 conference in Dublin this week, but sadly that's been cancelled, like many other conferences and events around the world in light of the coronavirus pandemic. So I'm really glad to be able to share the session with you today. Thank you very much for joining. I hope you're all doing well wherever you are in the world. So at ITAD, we've been doing realist evaluation for around 6 years now. And one of the big challenges that we often face, especially being within a consultancy setting, is actually having enough time and space to come together and reflect on our learning across different projects and different teams within the organisation. So a couple of years ago, we set up a learning group made up of team leaders and team members from across a number of different realist evaluations. Some of them are on the call today, I hope, so hello everyone. And from these conversations, we've developed a paper, the CDI practice paper that Heel mentioned, that's just been published. So you can get that paper for free now on the CDI website, and this presentation will distill some of the highlights from that paper. So today I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, what is realist evaluation? What makes it different? Secondly, what value does it add? And third, what lessons have we learned about how to apply it? So before we start, I wanted to get a sense of who in the virtual room has used realist evaluation before and who's completely new to it. So if you go to your Q&A bar on the screen, you'll see I've asked that question. And if you haven't already voted, use the little thumbs up icon to let us know who's new and who's used it before. At the moment, we have a pretty much a 50-50 split, which is great. I can see more votes coming in. Brilliant. So it looks like we have some people who are familiar with the approach and some people who are completely new to it. Hopefully you'll both find some insights that are useful to you today. I'm not going to do a really in-depth methodological introduction to realist evaluation, but I don't assume any prior knowledge, so hopefully you won't be too lost. So the practice paper and this presentation draws on various lessons from 4 ITAD realist evaluations that we started. The earliest one started in 2013. All of the evaluations were funded by DFID, and they were all evaluating large multi-country programs across Africa, Asia and beyond, ranging from 13 million at the lower end to an enormous 5.5 billion at the upper end, which is the UK government's International Climate Finance Fund. And they were all complex to some degree, and by complexity I mean they often involved multiple components that were evolving with different activities that interacted with one another across different levels of a system. They often were implemented across several different contexts and looked slightly different in different countries and different programs. And they often had emergent outcomes, so outcomes that came about through a combination of different activities that couldn't be predicted in advance. And the 4 evaluations were firstly the Compass programme. So that's evaluating the UK's international climate finance, which is essentially the UK's government's £5.8 billion commitment to help developing countries address climate change challenges. Secondly, the Braced evaluation, which is another climate change programme. It aimed to build the climate resilience of 5 million people across 140 organisations and 13 countries. The BCure evaluation, which is the one I know best. I was involved in this one from the beginning. And this aimed to build government capacity to use research evidence in decision making across 11 different African and Asian countries. And then finally, the evaluation of the West Africa Food Markets Programme, which aimed to tackle the causes of market failures within food markets. So I'll be drawing on examples from all 4 of these cases today. So what's realist evaluation and what makes it different? So realist evaluation is a theory-based approach. It was originally developed by Pawson and Tilley around 20 years ago in their book Realistic Evaluation. And although it's been around for 20 years, it's really picked up momentum in the past 5 years or so. It's particularly popular in the health field. There's still relatively few examples within international development, but they're growing all of the time. And the key thing about realist evaluation is it doesn't ask what works. Instead, it asks how and why does this program work or not work, for whom and in what circumstances. And the nuanced answers that it gives here are really useful to understand why programs succeed and fail, and are also able to provide insights that can help guide decisions about whether to roll up the program or whether to scale it out, or insights that are useful when you want to try out things elsewhere. So I'll go into some of the reasons why realist evaluation can do this during the presentation. And one question I've often been asked is what really makes realist evaluation different from other evaluation approaches? And the answer to that really comes down to the various underlying set of assumptions and philosophy that underpins realist evaluation. Firstly, about what is a program. Realists understand programs in a particular way. Secondly, the understanding of knowledge and evidence, what counts as knowledge and evidence. And finally, the realist understanding of causality. So I'll go through each of these in turn. So firstly, realist evaluation sees programs as theories in action. So every program is assumed to be underpinned by a set of theories about how and why that program works. Often these theories are incomplete. They might be in stakeholders' heads. They're often unconscious, and different stakeholders might have a really different idea about whether and how and why a program works. But the idea is that they are always there, and it's the task of the evaluator to articulate and test them. Realist evaluation is the process of testing program theories. And by program theory, I mean a theory that simply explains how and why a specific program works, for whom, to what extent, and in which context. Realists also hold that the social world is inherently complex. Programs work through introducing new ideas and new resources into existing social worlds and social systems. And this means that programs are inherently complex too. As a result of this, because programs are complex interventions introduced into complex social systems, that means that you don't have an intervention that works in the same way for everyone, everywhere, all of the time. Programs and interventions have different effects depending on the context. So context is really crucial within realist evaluation. The second set of assumptions relates to how realists understand knowledge and evidence. So realists assume, because they assume that the social world is complex, like I just mentioned, it's constantly changing. And our understanding and our tools as evaluators, they can help us understand the world, but they're not perfect, just like our understandings are not perfect. And they'll never give us the full picture, especially because the world is constantly changing. So we assume as realist evaluators that our theories can only ever be an approximation of reality. And in order to get closer to that, we revise and we develop and test our theories in an iterative way through collecting more evidence over time and using that to improve our theories. The aim is to get to a revised and tested theory that provides a good enough explanation. It's quite pragmatic. It'll never be perfect, but a good enough explanation, while recognizing that this explanation will continue to have to evolve over time. And realist evaluation is also methodologically eclectic. It doesn't come with a set of tools and methods that you need to use, and instead it draws on qual or quant data and any tools or methods that you need, basically, to collect the type of data to test your theory. And finally, the realist understanding of causality. This is the biggie. So realist has a very particular set of assumptions about causality and about how you can show a causal link between a program and an effect. So program outcomes are understood as being caused by causal mechanisms, which are triggered or fire in certain contexts. This idea of mechanism is completely central within realist evaluation. And a mechanism is crucially isn't an intervention. It's the force or the power or the process within that intervention, within that program, that causes change. So programs don't cause change, mechanisms do. So let's take an example. If you take a really common program that we're all familiar with, a training course that you're using to try and change people's behavior in some way. Realists assume that it's not the training course that leads to change. It's a certain set of mechanisms that are fired within that training course. So maybe the course works by giving participants a kind of aha moment where they realize that what they've learned can immediately improve what they're doing. So they go away and they apply it straight away. Or maybe they meet people at the training course and form new networks which help them to do their jobs better. Or maybe the training has given them a really practical, useful new tool that helps them solve a problem or helps them do their work more easily. Or maybe it's more about incentives. Maybe their boss has told them that they need to apply the work that the things that they've learned in their training in order to get a promotion. So these are the mechanisms. And a crucial point here is that these mechanisms will only fire if the context, if the circumstances are right. So for example, this peer network mechanism might not work if everyone in the training course is very different from one another. They don't have anything in common. Then maybe this mechanism won't fire. So in realist evaluation, we establish a causal link between a program and an outcome through developing theories about these mechanisms. And the theories take a particular form, the context mechanism outcome configuration. theories about how mechanisms interact with context to generate outcomes. And these CMOs, or context mechanism outcome configurations, generally take the form of sentences or paragraphs explaining the program and how and why it works. So this is an example from the braced evaluation here. In some of our evaluations, we found it helpful to add a new component to the configuration, intervention factors. And this helps distinguish features of the intervention that you can control from features of the wider context that you can't control. This has helped us in a number of our evaluations. So I'm just going to pause at this point and hand back to Heel in case there's any clarification questions before I move on.
Thank you, Mel. This was brilliant. I don't see many questions yet, so I think you best perhaps can proceed, and I will collect the questions and we do the Q&A session afterwards.
Fantastic, thanks, Heel. Okay, so now I want to talk about the value that we feel as our Realist evaluation learning group, the value that we feel the Realist approach can bring and has brought to our evaluations. And there's 3 areas that we focus on in the paper. Firstly, we feel that Realist evaluation can enhance clarity, depth and portability. Secondly, we think it can help us grapple with context and complexity within our evaluations. And third, we think it can really help to engage stakeholders for learning and adaptation. So firstly, the CMO configuration is really helpful to force precision and depth within an evaluation. So many evaluations use a theory of change to explore whether a program works. That's common, I think, and familiar to many of us. But many theories of change stop short of actually developing detailed explanations of how and why the activities lead to particular outcomes, kind of the arrows underneath the boxes, if you will. So sometimes evaluations do consider this, often in the form of assumptions, so spelling out the assumptions underlying the theory of change. But in our experience, these assumptions are sometimes not systematically interrogated, and Realist evaluation makes it possible to really interrogate these assumptions in detail by putting CMOs at the heart of the investigation. The BCure evaluation team, so the diagram I've just put up as an example from BCure, we found it helpful to use quite a high-level theory of change to provide an overview of how the program's supposed to work at a high level, and then we developed CMOs that kind of underpinned the arrows that explained specific causal links within the program. And this provides a really detailed explanation of how, why, in what context, and through which intervention features BCure actually led to change in evidence use. So the boxes that you see on the diagram translate into this really detailed CMO configuration to the right-hand side, which I've made deliberately small so you don't try to read it. The point is that it's rich, it's nuanced, and it's detailed, and it's also explicitly tested. So this gives us confidence in the arrows, not just the boxes. Another reason that Realist evaluations can enhance clarity, depth, and portability is through encouraging us to really build on existing theory and evidence. So Ray Pawson, who's the grandfather of Realist evaluation, he likes to call this standing on the shoulders of giants. And the idea is that useful insights might be available from really quite different fields, because similar causal mechanisms frequently underpin interventions across a lot of different sectors. So, for example, the theory of deterrence, this idea that you can deter people from doing something that you don't want them to do by increasing the risks that they'll face. That's a theory that underpins a lot of interventions and a lot of different policies across many sectors. So the point is that by building on existing theory, we can generate richer insights that are grounded in what we already know, instead of starting from scratch with every new evaluation. And this is important in any evaluation. Doesn't just apply to Realist evaluation, but again, we often find that this doesn't happen in practice. So, for example, in the second year of the BCure evaluation, we noticed a pattern across some of the BCure contexts. We found that people were more likely to change their behaviour when the implementers worked to develop this really collaborative relationship with government partners, and when they were really flexible in the type of support that they provided through the programme. And change was less likely when BQO did more kind of ad hoc work through one-off capacity building programmes. And we found that this insight resonated with evidence that we were aware of from the governance literature on adaptive programming. And this also talked about the importance of programmes being problem-driven and iterative and flexible. So drawing on this evidence base helped us to articulate this mechanism of accompaniment, this idea that providing tailored and flexible and responsive support can help lead to better, more long-term outcomes. And we kind of revised and tested this mechanism over the course of the evaluation, and it ended up being one of our main conclusions, and actually really quite helpful in other evaluations that we've done ever since. And finally, theory in realist evaluations helps make findings portable or generalizable, because it helps us to apply knowledge about how a program worked in one place to make decisions in another place. And we found the ladder of abstraction metaphor really helpful to understand this. It's used by many other realist evaluators too. So at the bottom of the ladder, you have more granular insights about how a specific intervention works in a very specific context. So about your particular program that you're looking at, for example. But as you build evidence, as you accumulate evidence over time and draw on insights from the broader literature, it becomes possible to develop theories or refine theories further up the ladder at a higher level of abstraction. And these theories help explain how different types of activity, different categories of activity, work in different types of context. Theory at this level is often called middle range theory. And the idea is that if you can say something about different types of programs and how they work in different types of contexts, you can apply those insights to new settings above and beyond the specific program that you're investigating in your evaluation. So a really valuable feature of CMOs is that you can develop them at any level of abstraction. And the realist evaluation provides a framework that allows us to move up and down the ladder and generate more generalizable findings. For example, the first Compass evaluation developed CMOs across 25 programs and tested them, looking at how and why integrated climate finance led to additional climate change benefits within these programs. Then the evaluators used this to develop more abstract CMOs further up the ladder of abstraction, which applied across the whole ICF portfolio, which is a huge set of programs. And this was used to help inform a review by ICAI, the Independent Commission for Aid Impact. And it also helped DFID identify how they could support their programs to kind of do things better, to understand climate risks and opportunities within their programs. The second way that we see realist evaluation adding value is through really providing a framework to cope with context and complexity within an evaluation. So in many evaluations, we find that context ends up in its own standalone section of a report. So instead of being fully integrated into the findings, you do a context analysis and then don't use it in your evaluation. But because realist evaluations have CMOs, context remains really central, and the evaluation really explores the interactions between context and mechanisms. One major challenge that we often face as evaluators is that context is really huge. There are potentially infinite contextual factors that affect any specific program. But realist evaluation helps us to overcome this because it forces us to hone in on the specific features of context that are relevant, that affect the mechanisms that we're looking at within the program. So for example, this might be participant gender, or might be ethnicity, it might be about workplace hierarchies or financing, or pressures from civil society, or global economic trends. The point is that it forces you, realist evaluation forces you to be really specific about the factors that matter and build those into your explanations. And CMOs also provide a framework for understanding change within a complex system. So for example, in BQO, we unpacked interventions that were being implemented at different levels. Some were targeting individuals, some were working within organizations, others in networks, and others at the broader institutional level. And CMOs helped us to show how outcomes at one level can create a conducive context that allows mechanisms to fire at another level, which leads to further outcomes. And it helped us to explore feedback loops between change that happened at these different levels of the system. That was also really helpful for the braced evaluation to show how resilience is actually something that comes about through change at different levels, individual, institutional, inclusivity, all of these things. And the third way that realist evaluation can add value is through providing helpful tools and lenses to engage with key stakeholders, so be that program implementers or evaluation commissioners. And it's important to say here that realist evaluation isn't necessarily participatory. It doesn't have to be. You don't need stakeholder engagement to make it work. And there are also challenges in making it participatory because it's quite complex and because the realist jargon can be quite impenetrable if you're not careful. But within our realist learning group, we really felt that this was an area that has a lot of potential if you kind of put the effort in. So one area that's really potentially valuable is co-creating theories collaboratively with implementers and with commissioners, which can help evaluators focus on the issues that are a priority for future programming. And it can help develop theories that are relevant, theories that are using the lenses and using the language of participants, program implementers and commissioners, so that it makes it more relevant to them and more likely to be able to use the findings. So, for example, the Compass evaluations worked with an evaluation steering group, and there were policymakers and evaluation specialists in this group across a number of different government departments. And the steering group helped to develop and revise the theory and helped ensure the evaluations really remained focused on the key areas of relevance. And if you remember, this is a £5 billion investment. It's really important to focus in on those issues and those aspects that were most relevant to policymakers. Secondly, realist evaluation helps to generate really nuanced evidence that's practical and actionable. So for implementers, this might be granular insights at the bottom of the ladder of abstraction about why a specific intervention worked in a particular place, to help them improve their kind of day-to-day programming and make course corrections and that sort of thing. But for commissioners, it might be that they need more abstract lessons about the types of interventions that work in different types of environments to help them make strategic decisions about where to focus their efforts and what projects to fund in the future. And we found that if stakeholders are involved in this process, in the generation of evidence and the co-creation of theories, it can provide really valuable opportunities for them to reflect and learn. So, for example, the braced implementing partners used their midterm evaluations as an opportunity to learn about what was working and why in their context, through really thinking about the mechanisms and how they were working. This helped them understand their programs better, it helped them make course corrections, and it had a spillover effect that we weren't really anticipating, which was that a number of implementers kept using the realist lens and this realist way of thinking in their annual reporting activities, which helped generate much richer routine monitoring reports than previously. So before I go into the final part of the presentation, I'm going to hand back to Heel to see if we have any questions.
Thank you, Mel. Yes, we have some questions, and there will be more questions, I suppose, because of the delay between the moment that we read them and you write them. One of the questions perhaps where you can expand a little bit is on the multiple CMOs or the multiple theories and intervention theories which are often embedded in one big program. So how do you limit that complexity, or how do you select the CMO configurations within that very complex and multifaceted program?
Yeah, completely. And that was a challenge, and I'll actually come on to that in a little bit, but I'll answer it now. So I think a key thing that we learned was that you need to set boundaries in a realist evaluation, because it's impossible to look at everything, especially in a really large program where there's lots of activities working at lots of different levels. You can't look across all of the mechanisms that are working in any level of depth. There's this whole kind of depth versus breadth conundrum. And in the BQ evaluation, we really felt that, and we felt like we were stretching ourselves too thin. And you also have to think about where you're getting your evidence from, and it's often from interviews with a few key stakeholders, which will be, there's only a certain length of time you have to do these interviews, and there's only a certain number of theories you can really probe and investigate within those limited time. So it's really important to set boundaries ideally with the commissioners and the implementers, and look at which areas of the program are least well understood. Where do you really need evidence of how and why things are working? Are there certain change processes that you don't understand or that you're confused about? Or are there certain areas of the program that are working differently for different groups that you want the realist evaluation to hone in on, and really focusing there? So I think that was a key lesson for us, is don't try to look at everything, set boundaries, do it early, and do that with the commissioners and the implementers to make sure you're focused on the things that really are of most interest to them.
Thank you. Hey, another question is, perhaps you can elaborate a little bit about what's the difference between a realist evaluation and a theory-based evaluation based on the exploration of the theory of change.
Yeah, so I think it's really those three things that I talked about earlier, and some of it is quite subtle because there is overlap to other types of theory-based evaluation. But in other types of theory-based evaluation, you don't have this specific investigation of mechanisms and how they operate in different contexts to lead to outcomes. So that's something that's a bit different about the realist evaluation. And also the whole realist philosophy that I talked about earlier, the realist assumptions about how you understand knowledge and evidence, how you investigate those, and how you learn about programs and demonstrate causality. It's those things that make realist evaluation different. And in practice, some of those aspects are used in other types of theory-based evaluation too. But in realist evaluation, it's really taking that realist way of thinking about the world and then translating that into everything that you do within the evaluation.
Thank you. A third question, the last one for this section, is can you elaborate a little bit about the combination of method you use for data gathering or evidence gathering in those projects?
Sure. So I can talk mainly about BQ again, because that's the one that I'm most familiar with. So we mainly used semi-structured interviews with government stakeholders who worked in the countries that BQ was operating in. And that added up to quite a large evidence base by the end, kind of over 600 interviews, I think, over the course of the 3 years. And we also drew on program monitoring data and documentary evidence and political economy analysis that we did in the final year as well. I think in an ideal world, a realist evaluation will use both qual and quant data. Ideally, you would have quantitative data of your outcomes to show you, what's changed, and to also show you kind of differential change across different groups. That's really helpful because then that allows you to drill in to explore kind of how and why things work differently for different groups of people or for different kind of units within your evaluation. And then you'll need qual data to investigate mechanisms. And contextual data can be a combination of qual and quant, but often you'll get information on context from things like administrative records or program monitoring data and things like that.
Thank you. Let's continue, and then we have the questions at the end.
Great, thanks, Giel. Okay, so this final part of the presentation, I'll go into some of the lessons that we learned about how to make realist evaluation work in practice. And again, the rule of 3, which runs through this presentation, I'll talk about what we learned about working with theory, working with context and complexity, and engaging stakeholders. So firstly, this idea about this lessons on how to work with theory. The first thing is really to avoid developing theories too soon. We kind of tried to do this in some of our evaluations to dive in and develop really detailed CMO configurations right at the beginning. But what we quickly found was that you can't develop a really good nuanced theory about how and why a program works until you actually know what the program's doing in depth, not just in a kind of high level way. But what's it actually doing? How is it working with which stakeholders? What resources is it introducing? And that's really hard to do. It's harder than we necessarily expected, because in some programs, you know, the commissioner the implementers don't know exactly what they're doing at the start. It takes them a while to work these things out. We often found that things might sound like they're the same across different contexts. So you might think, oh, well, this program's doing training and that program over there is doing training. It must be the same. But what they're doing is actually completely different, and there's different types of mechanisms that work. And sometimes if a program's adaptive, the activities may evolve over time as well. So what we learned was sometimes it's better to kind of hold your fire and don't dive in straight away to develop detailed CMOs. Like, wait for the right time and start off by developing more general theories, sometimes using kind of if, then, because as a way of thinking through in a more high level, broad way how the program might be working. So, for example, the World Africa Food Market program, this had an issue because it developed detailed theories really quite early on about 4 different thematic areas being targeted by the program. But then the grants were awarded, and it turned out that most of the awards fell within only one of these areas, and the other theories were kind of redundant. So there's a bit of a risk there. The second lesson is around the importance of the literature review. So really the importance of doing a literature review early on, but then reserving some resources to revisit it later. So the BCure evaluation did a really detailed literature review in the inception phase, which is available on the ITAD website if you want to see it. And this really helped us to develop our early program theory and our initial set of CMOs. But because realist evaluation is iterative, that means that you don't always know at the beginning what literature from what fields is going to be relevant towards the end. And in the third year, it was really clear that we needed to draw a bit more on theories from governance, for example, to unpack things like public sector incentives and blockages. But by this point, we didn't have a lot of resources to do this, and we didn't have that much time. In contrast, the BRACE programme, it managed this better because there was a parallel research programme that was being led by another partner within the consortium, and that allowed the evaluation to kind of bring this evolving research into the evaluation and into the theories as it went along. And the third lesson here is around the importance of balancing formal theory from the literature with the informal theories that stakeholders have about how the programme works. Both of these are really important, and one of the big values that realist evaluation can bring is in balancing the two of them. If you have too much formal theory, the evaluation findings can potentially seem a bit too academic to implementers or commissioners. And if you're working in low and middle income countries, there's a risk that if you take too much formal theory into your theories, it will be too Western centric, or it will use kind of languages and lenses that don't resonate or make sense in the countries that you're working in. So the BCure team used workshops with implementers at the start of each data collection phase to kind of help us sense check our theories and help us ensure that the implementers' hunches and their own kind of thoughts about how the program worked were built in, that they could recognize the theories and that they could see their program in them. So the second set of lessons is on working with context and complexity within a realist evaluation. And the first lesson here is around drawing boundaries and setting priorities, which was one of the questions that I answered earlier. And like I said, we kind of learned this the hard way in some of our evaluations. It's really difficult to look at everything. It's actually not possible to do. We found that kind of high level theories of change or program theories was quite useful to help make to help decide what the priorities were and make decisions around the boundaries. So, for example, you can see here this was a This was a theory that we shared with DFID in the final year of the Beaker evaluation, and we used it to kind of guide conversations about where we should focus, which links in this theory are you really interested in? Where do you want us to focus in the final year? And under Compass, like I mentioned earlier, there's an evaluation steering committee, which was really helpful because it really helped set these priorities from the outset. The second lesson is around the importance of collecting data on both micro and macro contextual factors. So context in realist evaluation is very broad. It ranges from everything from kind of high-level institutional factors that might affect a program all the way down to micro individual psychological factors, people's motivations and also people's characteristics like gender or ethnicity and how those affect mechanisms in the program. We found that it's often easier to collect data on the micro stuff, and it's often easier to see how that fits into your context mechanism outcome configurations. It can be really hard to work out how to build things like macro political changes and incentives into your theories. We found in the Beaker evaluation that actually using political economy analysis in the final year was very helpful to help us to do this. And in future, we would definitely do that from the outset if we thought that some of these macro factors were going to be important. And finally, view CMOs as flexible framings rather than rigid constructs. So I've talked a lot about the benefits of CMOs and the value that they add in terms of like the depth and the nuance that they can bring. But there's also a risk with that. There's a risk that they can seem quite linear. So C plus M equals O. You're kind of forcing these messy, complex processes into neat boxes which don't reflect how things actually work in the real world. And there's also the perpetual challenge of distinguishing between context and mechanism. You can spend a lot of time as an evaluator kind of agonizing over whether something is a C or an M. So across all of our projects, we found it helpful to move away from treating CMOs as these rigid C plus M equals O and kind of agonizing over what fits where, and towards viewing them as kind of flexible framings that are there to help you drill into complex reality. To drill into the heart or the essence of what it is that's making the change within a program. And during the write-up stage in the Braced evaluation and also the Beaker evaluation, we started presenting CMOs as paragraphs rather than simple sentences or kind of complicated tables, because we found this provided a lot more explanatory freedom. And that this kind of helped us to include all of the complex aspects of C's and M's and O's without being too reductive. And finally, some lessons on working with stakeholders. So the first point is the importance of making time and developing tools and processes that really help support engagement. So it's really important that the Commissioner understands the implication of a realist approach, especially the need for flexibility in your data collection and your analysis, because it's iterative. You don't know at the outset exactly what data you're going to need to collect and what stakeholders you're going to need to talk to in year 2. That will change over time. So it's especially important to, in kind of multi-year evaluations, when the evaluation manager is likely to change, which happened to us in BQ, where we had 3 managers in 3 years. It does take a lot of time to kind of get people up to speed and make sure they understand the methodology, make sure they buy into it. We found that things like short design papers were really helpful. We would develop them at strategic points to kind of make sure that DFID stayed engaged. And there's also the issue of building the capacity of implementing partners if you're depending on them to help you collect data, realist data. So this was the case in the Braced evaluation. It was really important for them to build in enough time for capacity building and mentoring, because it takes time to learn how to think like a realist. This isn't a simple approach that you can just apply overnight. It takes support and time, so you need to kind of build that in. And the second lesson is the importance of making theory practical and making it timely. So realist terminology can be hard going. All of this talk of context mechanism outcome configurations, and it can also feel very academic. And we found that different types of stakeholders will have different levels of tolerance to have these sorts of conversations. It might be fine with, program implementers who are used to theory of change workshops, but the World Africa Food Market evaluation, they found it really hard to engage private sector stakeholders and get them to think about how and why their business models worked. It just wasn't something they were used to doing. So it's really important to find tools and language that makes theory as practical as possible. And we found that it's often helpful to drop the language of CMOs altogether, so don't even talk about them in your workshops, and instead find simple ways to get the type of information that you need. So tips that we've kind of gleaned from the wider evaluation community that have been really helpful are things like ask why 5 times to keep drilling down into the heart of what's making change and try to find the mechanisms, or ask things like, why might this not work, and when, to help you understand the context and to help you understand for whom the intervention might work or not work. And the other key point is to try to align your evaluation activities with program decision points so that stakeholders can build their learning into the program. So this was possible in some of our evaluations and it wasn't in others. So in the BQ evaluation, this was difficult because by the time the evaluation had generated findings, program implementers were already full steam ahead with the next stage of their program. And because it was the program wasn't set up to be adaptive, they didn't have a lot of scope to change their plans and their activities based on the learning that was coming out. And finally, it can really help to keep realist terminology under the bonnet in reports. So instead of presenting your CMOs front and center in the analysis and structuring your whole report around them, focusing on a really coherent story, telling a really coherent and really compelling story about why and how your program works, and finding ways to display your CMOs that will resonate. So the BQ and the BRACE reports used to pull out boxes to display the CMOs, and they also used kind of short vignettes from different projects to kind of help tell the story of the programs and to make the findings much more accessible. That can often help to have a really detailed methodological annex where you put all of the detailed technical points instead of putting them in the main reports. So in summary, to summarise what I've talked about today, we really feel that realist evaluation helped us and enhanced our evaluations, both in terms of their use and their usefulness. And it helped us to generate really kind of actionable findings that fed into learning and decision making. So this quote on the right was from the DFID management response to the BQ evaluation. And we really found that the mechanisms that we generated through that evaluation helped feed into the follow-on program that came after that, as well as our thinking as evaluators in future work that we've done ever since. But that's not to kind of underplay some of the challenges, and learning to think like a realist does take time and effort. So we really think it's important to acknowledge that and to make sure that you're aware of that when you decide to use the approach. And if we were to summarize our lessons into kind of 4 key things, we really think it helps to set the boundaries earlier rather than later. Recognize that you can't look at everything. If you don't have a lot of time or resources, it might be better to use a realist evaluation as a small component within a larger evaluation, or use it as a case study rather than as the overarching approach, rather than stretch yourself too thin. The second thing is keep it simple, at least at first. So we often spent too much time developing detailed theories up front at the start of the evaluation before we understood the intervention in sufficient depth. And it's also really helpful to view CMOs as a framework, a flexible framework rather than a rigid one. So keep it simple. Third thing is build in enough time and resources for iteration and for engaging your stakeholders. We consistently underestimated how much time you need for this really iterative approach. And finally, find ways to engage stakeholders in ways that work for them. So, find key moments where you can really engage them and where the findings that you generate can feed into their learning and their decision making. And try to avoid theory fatigue among program staff, which is always a risk. Thank you all very much for listening, and I'll hand back to Heel now for the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Mel. It was impressive. There are some questions, and one question perhaps is a good one to start with. Generally, when you reflect on the theory of change, you tend to look for the evidence that confirms your theory of change. And you tend to learn on ways to do things better. One of the questions was, do you also learn about why things fail? Is that also something which you could see in your programs, that you learn about context, mechanism, outcomes, or causes of failing projects?
Yes, so that's really crucial, I think, in a realist evaluation. So that's part of your core question. So in what context does the program work and not work? Because the whole assumption is that it won't work for everyone all of the time and in all ways. So that is an integral part of the investigation, is working out, well, when does this work and when doesn't it work? So in BQ, for example, we found that training was effective in some situations and less effective in other situations at actually changing people's behavior. And we drilled down to try and understand, well, when does it not work? And we found it was things like the training wasn't relevant to the participants. It wasn't relevant to their jobs. They were going to it because they were told to, rather than it being directly relevant to them. And it hadn't been tailored, and it wasn't using kind of local case studies and local contextual information. So yeah, that's a really crucial part of the investigation. It comes back to context. So in what context do the mechanisms not fire, and in what context do they fire to lead to the outcomes?
Another question which several people asked was, what is, you had the privilege of having a well-funded realist evaluation, starting from the baseline, or at least from the start of the program, doing several iterative cycles of reflection. Yeah. Some people ask if it's also applicable for one-off, midterm, or end-line type of evaluations.
Yeah, I think it definitely is. And I think actually iteration can happen to different timescales as well. So I think, ideally, if you have the time to run alongside a program, then your theory can iterate over the course of the evaluation, over the course of several months or years. But if you only have one point in time, you can still iterate. So you start with an initial theory, which might come from a document review or conversations with the stakeholders or the literature. And then you test that theory through data collection, and then you revise it through the analysis process, and then you can iterate it again, perhaps by having a stakeholder workshop where you take the theory and then you bring in more insights. So that iteration can be compressed into a single cycle of data collection. It doesn't have to take multiple years to do.
Thank you. Another question which came up is, I did have quite a lot of experience in different innovative methods of evaluation and impact evaluation. How does this, for instance, relate with process tracing or other similar type of methods?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we see realist evaluation as sitting in the school or the family of theory-based evaluation approaches. So kind of alongside things like contribution analysis, process tracing, QCA, and other sort of theory of change-based approaches. And it kind of complements. It could run alongside a lot of those approaches, or elements of those approaches could kind of be brought in to kind of run alongside it. I guess the reason that you would choose realist evaluation over some of these other theory-based approaches is if you were really interested in drilling down into these questions of what works for who and why and what contexts. So trying to kind of understand those nuanced questions about how and why the program works. And I think that's where it really adds value over and above some of these other theory-based approaches, which have a kind of different focus. So contribution analysis is much more focused on understanding relative contribution. It doesn't have that same kind of lens of drilling into the how and the why questions and understanding those in the same level of depth. And I would say the same is true for process tracing, which is really useful for giving you a very robust explanation of why a program has led to a particular outcome, but it won't give you these kind of nuanced, differentiated insights into why it works in some places and not in others, for example. And that's where realist evaluation really adds value. And you can combine them within an evaluation if you're interested in answering all of these questions and if you have the resources to do that.
Yeah, I also think that the programs that you mentioned are so unique that it is also a very good way of getting learning from those type of atypical programs, while other methods often are very much geared to interventions or programs that you want to scale or you want to replicate. While this is also a possibility of learning from complexity, while you know that will always be different when you implement the intervention in other context.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's also really good in situations where program's new, it's a pilot, so you don't know yet exactly how and why it works. You don't already have a theory, you're trying to kind of build that up, so it's really useful in those situations as well.
What a related question, of course, is the funding issue and the donors which are open for this type of approach of learning about impact, and also as a substitute or as a parallel process with impact evaluation. Can you say something about it?
Sorry, Hill, could you repeat that? I kind of missed, I lost the thread of it a little bit.
Now, the question is if it is also dependent on a lot of funding, and who are the funders where you are, which you know that are open for this type of approach to evaluating of impact?
Yeah, so does it depend on a lot of funding? So our guidance internally is that if you want to take an overarching realist evaluation approach, we would generally say you want a medium to large budget, depending on the size and the scale of the evaluation. You don't want to be trying to do it on a shoestring. And that's because of all of the things that I mentioned in the presentation around, the need for this in-depth theorizing, the need for iteration, the need for literature review, all of this stuff kind of adds up in terms of the resources that you need. But it is possible to do it if you have a small budget. You just have to be really realistic about what is possible to look at. So it might be that you only focus on one aspect of your theory of change, or maybe you just do a small number of realist case studies. And the other thing to think about is that one of the things that takes a lot of time and resources in realist evaluation is kind of getting the team up to speed on what the approach involves. There's quite a lot of learning required. So if you have a more experienced team who've done this before, it should be quicker because they'll be able to kind of jump into it straight away without needing all of that time. In terms of who's willing to fund it, so DFID have obviously funded a few, which are the ones we talked about today. But there are others who are interested in funding realist evaluation too. So in the US, we're finding that some donors are interested in it. There's less experience of realist evaluation in the US, but we're sort of trying to kind of push that a little bit. And we're finding that the NGOs are also really interested in this because they're interested in understanding kind of how and why things work. But I think there is still work to do to kind of promote the value and suggest the value of realist evaluation to commissioners and encourage them that this is something that they might want to try if they're asking the types of questions that realist evaluation can answer, which is partly what we're trying to do with this paper, is promote some of those conversations.
Can you also explain a little bit how you see the relation between external evaluators or external researchers and internal champions within the organizations or the interventions or the programs which you are evaluating? Yeah,
so this is where we think that realist evaluation has a lot to add, but where you have to really approach it carefully. So I think most realist evaluations that have been published so far tend to be sort of more traditional external evaluations where the external evaluation team collects data, but they hold the theories, and they develop the theories and test them, and it is quite separate, this kind of separation from the implementers and the evaluation team. But I think there is a lot of potential for it to be a more kind of developmental partnership and involving implementers much more closely in the development of the theories, getting them to kind of own that. And we saw Embrace a little bit where we encouraged the implementing partners to actually collect the data themselves and to really think themselves about what the mechanisms were. That has a lot, it can add a lot of value in terms of helping people to learn about what's working in their programs. So it's difficult to do because realist evaluation is a bit complicated, and the jargon can be a little bit impenetrable. So it's not necessarily easy to do that, and you need to resource that relationship and build a kind of learning developmental relationship from the outset. But we do think there's a lot of potential there, and that's where we want to take it in the future.
Thank you very much, Mel. I think I learned a lot. I hope that everybody learned a lot. We are at the end of our seminar, so I give it back to Emmy, or we just finish this. Thank you very much, Mel.
Thank you very much, Heel and Mel. That was really great. And we had 75 people at our peak, so really great that we had so many people joining us for such a great session. Thank you. I'm going to put my email address in the Q&A. If you have any feedback for us, we'd really love to hear from how you thought the platform worked and any of that kind of stuff. So please do get in contact with us. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks very much.